Hello and welcome to this workshop about seed starting. Before we talk about some of the practical details, I want to give some background for those who may not know some of the story behind what seeds are and how they work. And the story goes something like this. At some point in the evolution of life on Earth, plants discovered sex. This may sound mysterious and exciting, but simply put, the ability to mix and match genes allowed for better adaptation and evolution as conditions on our planet evolved and changed. Plants did this by creating mechanisms for pollen to be delivered to flowers to pollinate them and combine pollen and the genetic information in the ovaries of the flower. What results is a combination of the genes from the two parent plants. And when that happens, it creates a seed that can be dispersed to a new location to create a new plant. And these seeds are sometimes bare, they're sometimes inside a fruit or a pod, and there's all kinds of wonderful mechanisms to send them out into the world and get them to new places. Some plants, like dandelions, have little umbrellas attached to seeds that float on the breeze and carry the seed to a new place. Some plants have seed pods that burst open and shoot the seeds out. Some have sticky substances or even hooks that will hook onto the fur of a passing animal or onto our pant legs and get carried to another place. Some seeds can be digested and move through the digestive tract and come out in the poop and get fertilized and planted all at the same time. And equally impressive are the conditions needed for seeds to germinate, to sprout. Some pine seeds must be burned in a fire in order to germinate. Some seeds, many seeds, must be conditioned by winter weather or even frozen before they can germinate. And some have to be cracked open or scarred, a process that botanists call scarification. Some seeds are so tightly sealed that they will last hundreds of years and still germinate. And each seed carries within it all the information the plant needs to grow and flourish and reproduce. So, as gardeners, we depend on seeds when we plant our gardens. And over the millennia, wise women, I do believe it was the women, have continued to select which seeds they plant. Corn started out as a shriveled little ear, not bigger than the end of your thumb, called teosinte, a lowland type of grass. But over the centuries, careful selection has created what we now know as maize or corn. And the same process occurred for wheat and citrus and squash, most of the major plants on which we depend for food. And where we are now, and the current threats to biodiversity, come to a large degree because of major corporations latching on to seeds and trying through them to control our food resources. We'll talk about that possibly later in this workshop or at another time. But the main thing, before we talk about seed starting, is to realize that it is so important that we plant seeds, that we maintain traditional varieties, particularly those that are open pollinated or true breeding, rather than being hybrids. So, whether you're planting a hybrid squash seed from Vessey's or West Coast seeds or Annapolis seeds, you're planting a little bundle of genetic information that will sprout and grow and create another life cycle for the food plant or the beautiful flower that you're planting. Now, if you're interested in accessing a larger list of these wonderful true breeding and heirloom plants, I would suggest that you join Seeds of Diversity and access their list of the 90-something seed houses in Canada. Or even better, join them so as a member you have access to the seeds that are being grown by hundreds of other growers and gardeners across Canada. because as a member of that organization, you will be helping preserve and maintain the diversity of seeds that is now shrunk to a few thousand from the many tens of thousands that were formerly marketed across North America. So to join or to see the list of seed houses at Seeds of Diversity, just go online to www.seeds.ca. So now let's go out to the greenhouse and take a look at the practical details of how you start seeds. In the January greenhouse, it's only about 6 or 7 degrees in here at the moment, even lower than that according to my physical thermometer. But it's not a bad time to be starting plants if you have a place to begin growing them in the winter. And I do. Not here in my unheated greenhouse, but as I will show you, under grow lights in my basement, where I have racks of grow lights capable of starting more than 200 plants in 4-inch pots. So we're going to talk about some of the basics that it's important to know when you're starting seeds. And one of the most important is the soil that you use. You see here, and I'll include a shot of it, I have an entire bale of mycorrhizae Pro Mix, which I will use to start my seeds. Can you use soil from your garden to start seeds? Well, yes, you can, but you run a real danger of getting what is called damping off, a fungal disease that will stunt your plants and kill them. That's because of fungus spores that are in the soil. So I don't want to take that chance. It's too much work to take that chance on the seeds that I plant. So I use a proper sterilized potting soil that I buy by the bale for about $40 or $50. And you can see it's got vermiculite in it. It's very loose. It's made primarily from peat. And that's a suitable starting mix to use because you know you're safe from damping off. It doesn't have much nutrients in it, so you have to be thinking ahead about feeding your plants once they sprout. But for the initial germination, they're fine. You just need the seed to be in the soil, slightly damp, not too wet, and at a temperature that it needs for germination. And there's a chart, which I can share with you, that shows the appropriate, necessary minimum temperatures for germinating different types of seeds. Some, like broccoli and other brassicas, germinate at a low temperature, whereas warm weather crops like tomatoes or peppers may need a slightly higher temperature. The process of seed starting is really very simple. It requires a container. Here's a 4-inch plant pot. Here's a little peat pot. Here's a multi-cell seed starting container. And you can also use things like plastic containers that you tend to throw away or recycle. And in this one, I've tried to break a hole in the bottom, and I've managed to fracture the bottom. But as long as it drains, it must drain, I can use this for seed starting. And the process is very simple. You go to your bale of potting soil, you scoop in some soil, some sterilized soil, and you tamp it down, and then you're ready to plant. So I'm going to fill some containers that I can use for seed starting. And as I do that, one of the things that I'm doing as a home gardener who starts his own seeds is I'm creating a kind of a calendar in my mind regarding which seeds I want to start first. The thing is that when you're starting your seeds, you start a wheel turning. You start a calendar, a clock ticking. It will take a certain amount of time, varies from plant species to species, from seed to seed. It will take a certain amount of time for the seed to sprout. But once it does, you have a limited amount of time before it outgrows that pot and then has to be transplanted. You're starting early in the early spring to get your plants ready for planting out in late spring and early summer, because you have a window of time, a growing season, when it's warm enough to produce the food that you want your plants to produce. And depending on what type of plant and what type of seed, you might want to start it extremely early or not so early, because you don't want your plants to outgrow the container that they're in before you're ready to plant them out. So as you prepare your pots, fill them with proper sterilized potting soil. You're thinking ahead about which seeds are going to go in which pots at which time. And the more you do this from year to year, and don't be afraid of making mistakes. We all make mistakes. The more you do this from year to year, the more experienced and knowledgeable you'll be, and the better it will go. So now I have my plant pots filled with the soil. Here's a 4-inch pot filled with soil. That's my standard pot size, because I find them very easy to work with. I can start more than one seed in a pot, and because they're square and 4 inches, I can crowd them onto a shelf below a grow light to get them started. And I've got a variety of seeds here that I'm going to show you how to plant. I've got some coriander from our garden. I've got some cucumber seeds from Halifax Seed Company. I've got some King of the North sweet peppers from High Mowing in Vermont, one of my favorite non-Canadian seed houses. Some lettuce seeds from Vessey's in Prince Edward Island. Some Feng Ching Choy, which is a wonderful cold-tolerant Chinese green, also from Vessey's. And some yellow tomato seeds from a tomato called Galena that we grew in our garden, which I just love for their flavor and prolific production. And planting the seed is really very simple. So let me start with the coriander and show you how you do that. Simplest thing in the world, in a way. Now, one of the questions that will come up, of course, for people starting seeds is, I have some seeds, and they're from 2017, and now it's 2021, as people say. So these are 4-year-old seeds. Are they any good? Well, that will depend. It will depend on what kind of seeds they are, how you harvested them, and how you stored them. And I'm pretty careful, because I run a small seed company, Perfectly Perennial Herbs and Seeds, to store my seeds in a cool, dry place. And if you do that, then seeds can last a long time. Some tomato seeds that I have are already approaching 10 years old. I don't get full germination. Only slightly more than half of them sprout, but those half are still good. So here's some coriander seeds, some cilantro seed from 2017. Am I going to plant these? You bet. And one of the reasons I'm going to do that is because I've planted and replanted coriander here and kale and other plants for years. And I know that as I do that, as I grow the same true breeding variety in the same place year after year, I am slowly but surely adapting them to local conditions. Why do I say that? Well, because the ones that don't adapt die, and they're gone. And the ones that do survive selectively trim to the local conditions. So what I have here is more than old coriander seed. I have 4 little cilantro seeds from plants that I grew that represent an ongoing process of adaptation to local conditions. And I'm going to take them and I'm going to plant them into this 4-inch pot. And I'm going to plant 4 seeds, 1 in each corner, because that way I can maximize my growth space when I put this downstairs under the lights, which you will see. And then when the plants get bigger, I can tease them out of here and individually transplant them or plant them into the garden, depending on the time of year. Now, there's several different ways to do this, but this is one of the easiest for medium-sized to small seeds. You take a dibbler, like this Sharpie, and you make 4 little depressions in the corners of the pot, in the soil. Let me show you that. Can you see that? And then you take a seed and you drop it into each one of these little holes and poke it down. And now I've got 4 seeds in 4 little holes, and I just go like this. And I'm planted and I'm ready to start growing. Now the final step will be to put this somewhere warm under timed grow lights and give it a bit of water. But I won't do that now. I'll do that when we get downstairs into where the grow lights are. But there is one more thing that I must do, because I'm going to be planting a lot of seeds this year. I have to label these pots so I know what the heck is in them. So I'm going to reach over here to where I have a whole bunch of these little popsicle sticks. And I'm going to take my marker and I'm going to write cilantro, which is the name of the plant. And so I've got my label there. I stick it in the soil, and that pot is ready to go down to the space that I use for starting my seeds, keeping them warm and under lights. Now, when it comes to a larger seed, for example, here's a cucumber seed, and it's not a heck of a lot larger than the cilantro that I just planted, but it is a larger, flatter seed. When you're seed saving in the fall, when you're harvesting these seeds from inside the tomato or the cucumber or the kale pod on the mature kale plant, you have to make sure that they're really, really dry before you store them. And how do you do that? Well, it's called a snap test. A seed like this has to go snap to be dry. Just wasted a cucumber seed. Oh my, but I have lots more. So there's a question that I have to decide, depending on how big this plant is going to be when the seed sprouts and how big my pot is. Do I plant 1 seed or 4? In the case of the cilantro, that's easy. Those are feathery plants that will grow up and be easy to separate. So what about this cucumber vine? Even though the seed is small and flat, once it starts growing, it gets to be a honkin' big thing. So I better start with 1 seed per container. Now, a lot of people plant these days, and I see it online, into peat pods, little round pots held in mesh netting. And I don't do that. And I recommend that you not do that, because those containers are simply too small. Once the seed sprouts and it sets down roots and it begins growing, it will fill that tiny little peat pot in days, and then you have to transplant. So for me, that's a waste of energy. I'm going to instead plant these cucumber seeds into this plastic recycled pot, and I'm going to plant 2 of them, 1 in each corner of this container. I hope you can see them. They're right here. And I'm going to poke them down, poke, poke, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to pat the soil down, and I'm going to go and get my popsicle stick to label the seeds that I planted, and I'm going to go pickle cuke for these Wisconsin pickling things. And I'm going to write Halifax, because I want to know, I've got lots of seeds. I want to know which seeds I planted. So I've got that labeled, ready to go, and I'll stick that in. Now, these containers are really handy because you can start 1 seed per cell, and when it's time to transplant them, the roots will likely have wrapped around, and you'll have a nice little easy to squish out ball of soil. And if the soil is slightly damp, it'll hang together, because guaranteed you're going to have to transplant at least once into a larger pot, no matter what you plant in these size of cells. So it makes sense for me to get my seeds, my high mowing seeds for King of the North peppers, and shake out 6 pepper seeds. Hard to count 6 pepper seeds. And I'm going to go down and poke these. I'll lay them out first so you can see them on the surface of the soil. And then do exactly the same thing. And you can see these seeds hopefully in there. And I'm going to poke them down, poke, 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 poke. Give it a shake, and they're covered up. Now, how deep should a seed be planted? 1 to 2 times the diameter of the seed. So one more thing to say is that if you use peat pots for planting, this is a peat pot made out of peat, you need to water more frequently because the water goes right out through the walls of this at a much faster rate. Having explained that, I think we're ready to move downstairs and demonstrate where these plants go while the seeds germinate. The next step in all of this is to explain how to encourage your seeds that you've planted to sprout. And the key to that is consistent moisture, light, and warmth. So what I have here, and I will turn the camera so you can see it, is a setup with grow lights on 2 levels and plastic trays that I purchased very inexpensively from a big box store. These trays are wonderful because they hold the 4-inch pots. They'll hold 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 28 4-inch pots, which can start up to 100 or more seeds if you plant 4 to a pot, as I was doing for the cilantro in the greenhouse. And the other thing you can do with these that's so wonderful is that you can water from the bottom. What I mean is that using your watering can, rather than sprinkling water on the top, you pour it into the bottom and let it soak up through the bottom of the pots. And when you do that, the roots go down to find the water, and it encourages stronger root growth. So what I've done here is I've brought in my seeds that I planted, the ones that I showed you, and also a whole bunch of other seeds that I've started. And as I mentioned, when I was out in the greenhouse, it's the end of January, so what the heck am I doing planting seeds in the beginning of January? So the seeds that I've chosen to start now are cold adapted leafy greens that I will be able to plant out into the greenhouse or into covered cloches and cold frames in my garden, because most of my raised beds now have frames over them, and some have plastic and glass lids. And when you do that, things that are cold tolerant, like lettuce and arugula and corn salad and bok choy and plants like that, can do very well outside once they've established and sprouted and developed a strong root ball. So here I have, for example, chard. And I've put 4 seeds. I can see the holes where I put the 4 seeds. And here I have giant red mustard greens, which have such tiny seeds that I didn't try to poke them in. I just sprinkled a few in every one of these pots. And the same thing for the lettuce seed, which is not pelletized and therefore harder to selectively plant. And the same thing is true for rapini, for this form of broccolini that I grow. And then, of course, there's the Galena tomatoes that I planted outside. And the 6 little containers for King of the North peppers, and the pickling cuke in the plastic recycled container, and finally the coriander, the cilantro. So what I do next is I set up these grow lights and I place my plants as close to the lights as possible. So how I do that is that these grow lights are hung by chains and I can lower them down, you see, to get them really close to the plants. I'm going to get this one out of the way while I show and tell. But the idea is that you want your lights to be as close to the plants as they can possibly be, because one of the main mistakes that people make in seed starting is not having enough light. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So these are basically seeded, filled into containers filled with sterilized potting soil. And so this time I'm going to take my watering can, which is really full. I'm going to take one of the containers out of there, and instead of sprinkling water over the top, I'm going to pour water into the bottom of the tray. And because I'm doing that, I'll actually take this off so it goes more quickly. There we go. Plugged. By filling it from the bottom, the water that's underneath these plastic pots will soak up into all of them from the bottom. And that wicking up of the water, the wicking of the water up into the soil, is really an ideal way to water plants that you're starting, because it helps ensure that you don't have too much water. I can see it's already being sucked up, so I gotta water some more. It's surprising how much water you can provide in this way. And the neat thing is that you don't have to water quite as often. If you were to sprinkle a little bit of moisture on top, and these plants are sitting in a warm, dry house, that water that you sprinkle on the top will likely evaporate. And you'll have to come back the very next day and water again. But if you do what I'm doing now, you use a plastic tray, and you sit your plants on the bottom, and you fill the tray up so that the water in the tray is even an inch deep. Then that water will get sucked up into the bottom of the soil that's in these plant pots, and you don't have to come back the next day and water again. And probably that watering I just did, particularly because the seeds haven't sprouted yet, so they don't need much water. But this will provide enough water for the whole kit and caboodle for days to come. And I'll come back and I'll check by sticking my pinky finger into the soil to make sure that there's some dampness there to support germination. It's a wonderful way to water your plants. Now these lights, these grow lights here, which are LEDs, and these fluorescent tubes, which must be grow lights or full spectrum. The ordinary full spectrum tubes will do just fine, and they're cheaper than the so-called grow light fluorescent tubes. But these lights are on a timer. They're plugged into the wall through a timer, and the timer is set for 16 hours of light during the day and 8 hours off at night. That's an ideal day length because you're trying to maximize the amount of light that you're delivering. And one of the other things that's going on here is that even though this is in a corner of the basement of the house where in the summertime I make my wine, this is a double duty space. It's my wine making space and my seed starting space. So even though it's in a corner of the house, because the heater is right around the corner, there's a steady flow of air through here, and airflow is really important. You can see some other plants here, and you might be curious, like, what's that behind you? Well, this is a lemon plant that I started from seed from the Meyer lemon tree in my cousin's backyard in California. You can see some pepper plants here that are overwintering. And this is turmeric root that is growing quite happily here under the lights in a tray. A whole bunch of little threads of turmeric root. So in addition to seed starting, if you set up a very efficient space like this with grow lights on a timer, you can use it to overwinter plants that are perennials. And believe it or not, tomatoes and peppers in the right environment, grow as perennials. Pepper plants can go for up to 5-6 years. They have to be fed, they have to be repotted. Okay, so back to the seed starting here. It's very important that you plant the right seeds at the right time. What does that mean? That means that counting back from your first reliable frost-free day, you want to know how long it's going to take after you put the seed in the soil and begin to water it and keep it warm until that plant needs to be planted out into the garden. You work backward in time. And there are plants like the ones that I planted here. Let's mention what they are. Rapini and lettuce and giant mustard and chard and radish and this oriental vegetable feng ching choy that are ideal winter crops. So that was the hands-on part of the workshop where I demonstrated how you plant the seeds, select your soil and your containers, and set them up under grow lights and then water them in. And once they're watered in, and I showed you my trick for watering from below, which is more consistent and encourages root growth, then it's a matter of time. It's a matter of waiting. Some seeds can take weeks to sprout, although in most cases within 5 to 7 days you'll see evidence of leaves emerging from the seeds into the light. So there's some additional things to go over to make sure that you have a better chance of having success with your seed starting. And these are tips that were published in 2017 by Mark McDonald at West Coast Seeds out in British Columbia. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your knowledge and experience. And I'm going to pass these tips on to you because they are things that I've found to be true and useful in my own gardening. First tip is seeds, when they sprout, don't need fertilizing right away. The seed includes the nutrients that the young plant will need for at least a couple of weeks. When you transplant out of your original pot into a new pot, a larger pot, that's a good time to start dissolving some fish fertilizer, a small amount in the water, or Epsom salts, which really encourages growth. But do that very sparingly. Don't over-fertilize. Second tip that Mark shares, and that I'm going to share as well with you, is the right amount of water. If you see that the top of the soil is a lighter color and is drying out, what you do is you put the tip of your pinky down to see if you can feel dampness. If you can't, put it into the first joint, the first knuckle. If you still can't feel dampness, and particularly if plants start to bend over and wilt from the dryness, then it's time to water. But there is a danger in watering too much. Many people soak their plants down and they do it too often and the plants get moldy and they die. So you have to maintain a small amount of water until seeds sprout, but even after they poke up and begin growing, only a moderate amount of water. This is something that you learn over time, but mostly it's a matter of paying attention to the plants and to what they're telling you by the way they're growing or getting limp if they need more water. Lesson 3 is plants need lots of light. Not a little bit of light, lots. Because they need it to grow. They need it for photosynthesis. So grow lights or LED lights or a combination of that and sunlight, placing your plants in a sunny window will likely in the wintertime not provide enough light for growth. They need lots of light. The timer on my lights downstairs is set at 16 hours on and 8 hours off. And that's to ensure that the plants, even under those lights, get enough light. The other thing that I do, you may have noticed this when you were looking at the setup there, is that the lights are hung on chains so I can lower them down and keep them as close to the plants, inverse square rule it's called, as close to the plants to deliver as much light as possible. And as the plants grow, using the chains, I raise the lights up. The next factor to talk about is heat. Sprouting happens more quickly. Certain seeds really depend on warmth to sprout. So you want your seeds and the soil that they're sprouting in to be warm. Not hot, but warm. If you have a lid or a plastic cover over the pots where you're sprouting your seeds and you put them under lights, take the covers off. They're going to get too hot. You're going to cook them. But on the other hand, if you have a heating mat underneath, which I do for some of my areas, for seeds that really need the warmth, like tomatoes, peppers, and other kinds, and squash, then it really helps to speed up germination. The next key factor is air circulation. If you can buy a fan, invest in a fan, because moving the air prevents buildup of humidity, prevents mold, and the plant stems actually like waving a tiny bit in the breeze. It strengthens them. Air circulation in and around your plants is very important. The next thing to talk about is cats. You may have seen my cat wandering by in an early segment of this video workshop. We have two cats. They're sisters. And if we're not careful, for example, when we hung a plastic curtain in front of the setup downstairs that I just showed you, oh, what a nice place for a cat. And they climbed in and they lay down right on top of our seedlings and crushed them. So whether there's the danger of them using your seeding trays as a litter box, or rather just because they like the warmth, you need to think of ways of discouraging them from entering that space. You can figure it out. Another thing is just about timing. Seeds will take a while to germinate and then grow, and you want to time it so that they're ready to transplant at exactly the right time for your outdoor garden if they're going outdoors. And that means calculating back from your last frost day, or even earlier if you have cloches or protection from weather, and planting at exactly the right time. If they get big and they've outgrown the pot they're in, well, you transplant them to a larger pot and keep them going. How do you know when they need to be transplanted? Well, my rule of thumb is that when the plant is as tall as the pot is tall, then the roots have reached the bottom of the pot and they need to be transplanted. And if you don't do that, the roots will reach the bottom and they'll begin wrapping around the outside of the pot and they'll become root bound. And root bound plants won't grow. The expedient thing to do if you discover your plants are root bound when you transplant them is to trim the roots and hope that they'll start growing again. Because otherwise they've received this message that they can't grow, so why bother? The way to ensure that plants don't become root bound is by potting on. That means transferring them to a larger pot. So let's say I planted those 4 little cilantro seeds that I showed you out in the greenhouse, and they've gotten as tall as the plant pot that they're in. What do? You get a larger plant pot, say a 6-inch pot. You make a nice wide hole in the middle of it by packing the soil toward the sides. You take a teaspoon and you carefully extract that plant along with its roots. You don't touch the stem. You don't lift by the stem. You don't even touch it. Stems of germinating plants are very tender. And using the spoon and using your hand, you pick up the root ball, which should be slightly moistened. You transfer that to the larger hole in the larger pot. You gently tamp down the soil on all sides, give it a tiny bit of water, and it's good to go. So that's potting on, and it's an important strategy to know about. The next thing is label the crap out of everything. Label your plants, keep a garden journal, and record everything that you do. And the final thing that I want to share with you, it's number 10 on Mark's list, is the process of what we call hardening off. Hardening off is when you take your plants and you get them ready to go outside. And you can't just rush that, because the plants have been growing in a perfect, warm, moist, airy space, And if you pop them out on a cold day, they're going to suffer, and you're going to see them not do well. So what you do is you bring them out tentatively at first for maybe an hour a day and 2 hours a day on a really nice sunny day. You don't put them in direct sun because the sun as well can fry them. And you gently acclimatize them to the outside environment. If you have cloches or hoop covers or boxes over your raised beds, that can really help protect the plants while they harden off. And if you do all these things that I've been talking about and you've got good seeds, then you're going to have good growth and plants that will do well in your garden. But let's stop and say this one more time. Good seeds is the key. You need to go to the sources where you can find preferably open pollinated true breeding varieties, good plants for your climate, your location, and learn as you go which varieties do the best. And as you do that, you'll acquire knowledge. You'll acquire it as well by talking to your friends, fellow gardeners, neighbors. And the main thing that I have to say to you is this is a learning process. This is a journey. I could tell you stories about the plants that I've killed, but I won't bore you with that. We all have those stories. So gird your loins, plant your seeds, carry on, do it. It's wonderful. And if you ever have questions that you would like answered, I'm always happy to receive emails. Our garden company, Perfectly Perennial Herbs and Seeds in Puchco, Newfoundland, exists to help gardeners. That's our motivation. So if you want to write to me by email, every time you write, I will try and answer your questions or find someone who can. And our email address is info, I-N-F-O, @ perfectlyperennial.ca.